5 seconds to submergence. Submergence deep into the absurd.
Twilight of the Idols by Friedrich Nietzsche. What the Germans Lack. Aphorism 6. To be true to my nature, which is affirmative, and has dealings with contradiction and criticism, only indirectly and when compelled, I shall straightway set down the 3 tasks for the sake of which one requires educators. One has to learn to see. One has to learn to think. One has to learn to speak and write. The end in all 3 is a noble culture. Learning to see, habituating the eye to repose, to patience, to letting things come to it, learning to defer judgment, to investigate and comprehend the individual case in all its aspects. This is the first preliminary schooling in spirituality. Not to react immediately to a stimulus, but to have the restraining, stock-taking instincts in one's control. Learning to see, as I understand it, is almost what is called, in unphilosophical language, strong willpower. The essence of it is precisely not to will, the ability to defer decision. All unspirituality, all vulgarity, is due to the incapacity to resist a stimulus. One has to react. One obeys every impulse. In many instances, such a compulsion is already morbidity, decline, a symptom of exhaustion. Almost everything which unphilosophical crudity designates by the name vice is merely this physiological incapacity not to react. A practical application of having learned to see, one will have become slow, mistrustful, resistant as a learner in general. In an attitude of hostile calm, one will allow the strange, the novel of every kind to approach one first. One will draw one's hand back from it, to stand with all doors open, to prostrate oneself submissively before every petty fact, to be ever itching to mingle with, plunge into other people and other things. In short, our celebrated modern objectivity is bad taste, is ignoble par excellence. Aphorism 7. Learning to think. Our schools no longer have any idea what this means, even in our universities. Even among students of philosophy themselves, the theory, the practice, the vocation of logic is beginning to die out. Read German books. No longer the remotest recollection that a technique, a plan of instruction, a will to mastery is required for thinking. That thinking has to be learned in the way dancing has to be learned, as a form of dancing. Who among Germans still knows from experience that subtle thrill which the possession of intellectual light feet communicates to all the muscles? A stiffy, awkward air in intellectual matters, a clumsy hand in grasping. This is in no great a degree German that foreigners take it for the German nature in general. The German has no fingers for nuances. That the German have so much as endured their philosophers, above all the most deformed conceptual cripple there has ever been, the great Kant, offers a good idea of German amenableness. For dancing, in any form, cannot be divorced from a noble education, being able to dance with the feet, with concepts, with words. Do I still have to say that one has to be able to dance with a pen, that writing has to be learned? But at this point, I should become a complete enigma to German readers. All right.
Okay.
Well, welcome, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Have to sit down again and go through some thinking.
Awesome. So what are your thoughts on that passage?
First, I want to go to this line
Okay.
from aphorism 7. I'm going to leap a little bit forward because I think this is probably one of the most glaring, obvious aspects of learning that is very well satirized, discussed, and considered, but it's never put in those words in the same way, this grasping. What do we mean when we're grasping? I've never quite hit the nail on the head in that regard. By the way, Sartre, I don't know, he comes back, and that's one of the things that he speaks of, this grasping. And then Camus kind of in The Stranger is also talking about this grasping. I don't know if you remember when we read The Stranger, that aspect of it where Marceau is talking about how people are always just seem to be putting their hands out and grasping at things, both figuratively and literally. And I talk about this in terms of decision making and bringing objectivity into one's understanding of a concept. And in a way, grasping is kind of jumping to conclusions, is kind of the way that I see it figuratively. Nietzsche talks about it in that first aphorism. He says things come up to it to defer judgment and to acquire the habit of approaching and grasping an individual case from all sides. So he is using that terminology in referencing all that it takes to fully learn something. And this whole idea of deferring judgment is everything about learning. I mean, Benjamin Franklin said, "This Constitution is not the best that men can do. It doesn't even come close to what deity might accomplish. However, it's the best that I've seen thus far. And in my 83 years, if in these subsequent years I see something better, I'm likely to realize or help to realize that." 83 years of experience all over the world in all sorts of leadership, innovation, diplomacy, all these various roles that he held, and he still doesn't think he's fully been informed to put his stamp on it and say this is a perfect document? Absolutely not. It's just the best we could do while we were swinging fists at each other. And literally they were. And that's the part that people don't ever consider when they make judgments about the document. Everything that we do is going to turn out a product that's inferior to what the ideal is. That's why we consider the ideal in our minds. It's one of the reasons why in education and in learning, it takes a lot more energy and concentration to fully understand concepts than people are ever, or rarely, they're willing to expend that kind of energy. That's one of the reasons why I used to say in class, and I still say it, if I'm not making your brain hurt in this class, I'm not really doing my job. And that's learning how to think.
Yeah, chess players, when they play like in a tournament, I think they burn something like 6,000 calories when they're doing that because they're actually thinking, right?
It's a lot of thinking.
Yeah, it's a lot of thinking.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about how the ideal, it's never perfect. And that's, whenever you make a plan for something, it's never exactly how you want it to be.
It's not. We shouldn't be so disappointed.
No.
We should continue to aspire.
Can you say that again?
We should continue to aspire, even when we stumble in the learning process. Yeah. Yisung Jin, one of my mentors in my years, I would struggle with something. He'd say, "Sit down. Do you need me to slap you across the head? Because you're really not getting it." And maybe a physical, manifestation of that will help you move along. He'd say it jokingly. I was his Dong saying. I was his, I was younger, and so I was learning from him. But it kind of was something that kind of stuck with me. Do I need to force myself to put more into it in order to render something that's valuable to me in terms of understanding and knowledge? It takes a lot more than we think.
Yeah, it takes. It's kind of like with grasping something. When you're grasping something, you're holding on to it firmly.
Right. Or you're reaching and trying to grasp.
Yes. And that is, I think these days a lot of people aren't reaching. They're just waiting for it to come to them.
And they're not willing to really look at all of the variables to fully understand ideas.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny because when we talk about motivations of faith and we talk about motivations of knowledge, logical considerations being steps toward a particular goal, I often bring myself back to that understanding that this whole idea that's being put before me, whether it's been encapsulated into some kind of an ideological package or it's been marketed as a form of theology or spiritual edification or whatever it might be, for me to fully gain an understanding of that and take it on in terms of building an opinion that is well supported by an evidential foundation, we might say. In order for me to go about that, that is an awful commitment of time, energy, and consideration. So, as Nietzsche says, defer judgment. If one is fully willing and able to learn, that kind of sets right at the top, because all the variables have to be considered. And though some may be distasteful to me, I'm still to have full knowledge, as limited as the knowledge is in the world of humans. I have to do a lot more. And my deferring of judgment is extended over years, not minutes, not days.
Can you explain that?
Well, I've talked with many people who struggle with the idea that they put it into one form or another. There either is no deity as part and parcel to the wondrous world, the wondrous universe that is there for us in which we live, right? Or there is total control deity, and there's no way for us with our limited capacity over the course of even 60 years to start to come to terms with that it's maybe a little bit of everything.
A little bit of both?
Well, every aspect, every variable that we come into contact with. Mm-hmm. It might be a little bit of gravity. It might be a little bit of some aspect of physics that we don't understand. It might be vibrations. It might be the ohm. We know when the ohm is interpreted in various forms, it has a signature that's the same.
It's interesting because Yahweh.
Mm-hmm.
I heard that sound is supposed to almost represent what it sounds when you're breathing.
Right.
Yahweh.
Mm-hmm.
Yahweh. In and out. And
just like an ion with your heart.
Yeah. Yes. And the whole, those two sides of the spectrum, God or no God, I guess, is basically what you're saying. A lot of people they say, I see atheists, they want to defy God and all that. They look at the Bible and they think, oh, that's impossible, that can happen, therefore God doesn't exist, right? But a lot of times they don't understand that the Bible is a bunch of stories, and stories are more than facts.
Yeah.
Right. And God doesn't necessarily need to be some sort of man in the sky, but it can be beyond that, right?
Right.
It can also represent something other than God too, but these have so many different interpretations, so many different variables, as you said.
But let's just say for a minute we want to learn.
Yes.
Let's say that for a minute that we really want to know, by hook or by crook, by blind faith or by testing whatever it is we have in mind, putting our own thoughts and considerations to the test. Really? To gain a full understanding? Don't we have to read the Vedas? Don't we have to read the Quran? Don't we have to read the Bible? Don't we have to read and listen to the stories of those cultures that build around oral tradition and storytelling? So you can start to see the parallels, and you all of a sudden go, whoa, this is one very strenuous and arduous pursuit. Looking at 10 years of my life in gathering evidence either for or against a particular idea, one might come to the conclusion, well, you've done your due diligence. You really have striven to learn and to really understand this and to make it known. And I do like the term see, because I really do think it is a matter of having an opening to a figuratively visual understanding, in the same way that we come upon a beautiful view or something.
Like absorbing it.
Exactly, but it's not enough. It's not enough just to absorb. We have to grapple.
Yeah.
The written word and debate are really the only places where we have the opportunity to grapple with ideas. And we're not just grappling with them objectively as we would in a philosophy discussion in a philosophy class. We're grappling with them more so subjectively within our own hearts and minds. Maybe it takes more than 100 years of grappling.
Yeah, and there's basically an infinite amount of knowledge on the planet right now. Knowledge being anything from an essay to a random opinion to something completely
that
meaningless.
I have a hangnail or a ingrown toenail even is a manifestation of a state.
Yes.
So it can be considered knowledge, as silly as that sounds. But yeah, it's what good is it doing us?
Well, nowadays, not a whole lot.
It really isn't, is it? It's not.
And there isn't really any debate these days either, or at least a real debate. Like the last presidential debate, that wasn't a debate. No. That was just two old men, like, essentially bitching at each other.
And, well, you did get a little bit of that, but it's just memorized, recited, memorized, recited. It's just talking points in so many ways. And when we read things like this and we do start to see things a little more clearly, the first thing that we kind of defy is the use of somebody else's written words to try and denote something that we want to say, even though there's been no internal consideration within ourselves.
There's
talking points is that deep. That's it. There's no understanding. There's no realization. There's no aha behind any of them. It's a matter of trying to take knowledge, simplify it in such a way that it causes a momentary consideration in your audience, but you don't have the capacity to fully comprehend it. And with that tiny little representation of the idea, how is anyone ever expected to come to a level of comprehension?
And I will say
that's
that
not debate.
Sometimes it kind of has to hit a certain nerve when you're reading something, because I've noticed that when I'm reading something, I'll read it, then the following day I'll be kind of just doing whatever, and then I'll think about it again, and then it'll like strike this nerve almost. Then eventually it's like all this water, like basically a flowing stream of consciousness floods my mind, and I'm just like all over the place thinking about it. I'm like, oh, aha, right? Just like you said.
Yeah. You're flooded with norepinephrine, and that's what's causing that sense, that washing sense that you're speaking of.
It does usually happen after drinking coffee, so.
Yeah, you get a little more adrenaline, get a little more of everything when you drink coffee, don't you? Yeah, I always tell students that, yeah, you're not supposed to stay in the shower very long because, you know, you'll get the door knocked. Don't use all the hot water kind of thing. You know, but honestly, that's where you're going to have a lot of aha moments, simply because you're in a state where you are considering things. You're performing an act that's so automatic, you know, washing your hair, washing your body, that you don't really have to dedicate much thought to it, and therefore you open yourself up for deeper thinking. Not only that, you got the hot water. It's stimulating the capillaries at the surface of the skull anyway. You know that you start to have more blood flow when you have that, and that's when your brain's going to oftentimes go to that place. Not only that, if you're doing it in the morning, think about it. Everything that's processed through your REM sleep cycles is going to come to a full understanding, or you're going to have that moment of realization. And it's usually right shortly after you wake up. So you got all three conditions perfectly set to try and say, oh, this is what I was thinking. This is what I was searching for.
Yeah, and I've noticed it also happens to me when I'm at the gym. And so I had to start bringing my notebook to the gym because I always have so many thoughts.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I just walk around with like this, you know, this size notebook, right? And then between sets, I'll just write down my thoughts.
Perfect.
So,
do you write down various ways of saying it too? That's something that you'll want to kind of practice it, as I started doing that, and it really helped my writing. Just put it into a different verb form, or shift the syntax, or use a completely different set of vocabulary words to try and convey the same idea, but you're conveying it to yourself. So what you're doing is you're forcing, or at least this is the way I discovered it, I'm forcing myself to shift into different perspectives based on the ways that I've written it.
Okay.
And you can kind of tell right off. I don't know if you noticed, but you're reading a different translation of this work than I am.
Yes.
See, and that right there is exactly an illustration of what I was thinking. When you write things in a different form, how you gain a different perspective, or you access another facet of that understanding or knowledge.
Yeah, and this is actually the first translation of Nietzsche that I've read that wasn't Walter Kaufmann.
Yeah. That one's hard to find. Did you have
This one?
difficulty getting this one? Yeah.
I just found it on Amazon.
Oh, okay.
So,
Wow.
I don't know.
Some books I've purchased used, all of a sudden I can get them new. And then couldn't get them because they were out of print or whatever reason.
It's interesting.
About half of the books that I access are completely out of print. I'll either have to go to Gutenberg to get it, or they just aren't printing them. Kind of what he was saying there, that the pursuit of gaining knowledge and learning fully, it's just, if the motivation's not there, our world maybe moves too quickly. I don't know. I don't know if you noticed in that first aphorism how much he presses us on this idea of vulgarity.
Yeah, like how vulgar we are today.
How we've descended into a more and more vulgar state. It's almost, okay, it's not surprising to me. And if you have a conversation with my students I had in 2003, I was telling them the same thing even back then. Overuse of expletives and vulgarities will make them completely useless to you. They will nullify the effect, and they will blunt the meaning of that particular word to the point where you don't have a word. And all this nonsensical about how a word is violence doesn't jive with that consideration. You kind of need a pretty sharp, vulgar word on occasion so that you don't hit someone.
Yes, you do.
And the more that meaning is blunted through overuse and overembrace and openness in terms of vulgarity, the less power it then has.
And it's not just that we're using more vulgarity these days, but we're assigning vulgarity to more things.
Yes, absolutely.
And we'll say that before we started doing the podcast, before we started recording, we were talking about how Nietzsche predicts a lot of things. But I think it's less prediction and more so that he's very familiar with history and how things kind of ebb and flow. Because, there was times in our past where we were far more vulgar than we are today, right?
Oh, Canterbury Tales is a very good example.
Yep, Canterbury Tales. Or even in the Bible, right?
Oh, yeah. One doesn't like to jump to it, but yeah, some proverbs even.
Yes. So, as far as vulgarity goes, do you think there's any remediating of this from the individual sense?
Wow, from the individual sense. I was thinking society because we saw it post World War II.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's one of the reasons we're somewhat reserved, those of us who were raised in the 60s, 70s, 80s, though you see that as a time of opening up and sexual freedom and all this other stuff. No, the vast majority of people were still caught in this sense of they've had a glut. And I think that's what changes it. I think once you've had a glut of vulgarity, hatred, blood, guts, gore, and I could go on, there's no other place to go. You're moving into the realm of bloodlust. You're moving into the realm that so many civilizations have embraced and then lost their identity and then lost themselves and lost their civilization shortly thereafter. I know people like to look at the various, the Aztecs and these various South American civilizations that rose up and fell, but each one was ripe for their fall. And it was, if you study it, I haven't studied it fully, but I have consulted people who have explained this to me. If you study it very, very deeply, you find that they, as in many cases as cultures, had slipped into that form, embracing of vulgarity, embracing death as a means by which, well, I should say killing as a means by which one might understand the intentions of the universe. And though these people engage in this under the guise of some form of theology or some way to reach and ask for blessing, let's say, to use, for lack of a better term, I also think it's a little bit of individuals wanting it.
Wanting the blood, the violence?
Wanting the violence, yeah. I don't
Do you
know
think
if you've
that's a
noticed all this
product?
talk about civil war and things in our country. It's, why would anyone want that?
I don't.
We're still suffering the consequences of the first Civil War. I would say that this is just an echo 150 years later.
Do you think this like bloodlust is a product of repression?
What do you mean by repression?
Well, in our society today, we're very repressed.
Repressing our nature, you're saying, like our sexual
Our,
nature, or that? Because I would say we're not repressed in that regard. You can pretty much do whatever.
just our words are
Repressed,
repressed.
repressed in terms of thought,
Yes.
repressed in terms of seeking of truth, repressed in terms of gaining wisdom. Is that what? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. I'll come back and say yes, without a doubt. I grew up in a family where there was, until you were an adult, there weren't many avenues of seeking that one could share with the family without feeling some religious guilt. Let's just put it that way. And if one did not feel the religious guilt, of course, my father, being the pious and very religious man that he is, he would induce some of that guilt in order to make certain that it did happen, right? One might say that's a form of enforced repression, but still the individual must embrace that.
Embrace the repression?
Embrace the condition under which they are gaining so much while being repressed in certain ways. Deferring one's expression in that particular sense of life and living and knowledge in order to gain so much by just holding back.
Do you believe that discipline equals freedom?
You know what? At your age, I probably would have argued, and I was a very astute debater. I would have argued that against that idea, and I would have won. I know I would have won the round. I would have made certain that I would have won the round. But now that I've made so many awful mistakes in my life, truth reveals itself in spite of us. And that's a truth that reveals itself in spite of us. We limit what we do physically in order to maintain our bodies. We follow certain rules. I don't just go around jumping off 90-foot cliffs just for the fun of it.
You're right.
I love speed. I love the feeling of being weightless. But I don't do it.
Because you don't want to die.
No, let's say I wouldn't die. Let's say that it would be something that would be a great pursuit for a man in his 50s, to become a great diver, let's say, okay? While I'm so obsessed and involved in that and disciplining myself and conditioning myself, I'm setting boundaries, because by setting those boundaries, I become free to actually pursue that frightening and dangerous act.
I think that's part of having sight. You have to see into the future, and you have to understand what it takes to succeed.
Right, and in the figurative sense, it's exactly the same. In the literal sense, in the example I gave, but also in the figurative sense. For me to pursue knowledge, having so many responsibilities right now. My own parents in their 80s, granted they're, well cared for by my siblings, my older sister, and I really am blessed because I can feel comfortable in that. But also my own mother-in-law, taking care of her, taking care of her house, taking care of, after my father-in-law died, taking care of my kids who are now adults and make their own decisions and aren't always quick to come to you for a little bit of advice, even if they're going to ignore it. Grandchildren, you start to feel like I've got so many things that they're asking of me And the way that I take on teaching, I ask a lot of myself, and I don't know that students quite get that. They don't realize that all of the reading and all of the discussion and all of the study and all of the energies that I put in outside of the classroom are what make the class so that it can have those moments of illumination, those aha moments. I don't think they get it. But why do I do it? Why do I limit myself that way? Why am I reading for 5 hours every day to try and gain that knowledge and grapple with ideas? Well, for one thing, the pursuit of knowledge is a much more arduous task than we ever think it could ever be. And for another, it's part of those limitations and rules and structure that I enforce upon myself in order to gain something that's so much greater.
So I have something to say about that, where you said that the pursuit of knowledge it's a big task, right? I've been writing this fiction about how knowledge has kind of come in and overtaken everything in our society, whereas wisdom has been left behind.
Yep, shoved to the side.
Shoved to the side. Because knowledge is, that's the taking it in, that's the reading, that's the, watching videos, getting taught, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But wisdom is the digestion of knowledge, right? And that's the really hard part.
Well, I had a mentor once who was he was a science teacher at Coeur High School, and he just kind of saw something in me, and before he even met me, he started putting things in my mailbox.
Was this when you were young, or?
So when I first started at Coeur High School, I was 30 some years old when I started there. I was not some kid off the street. I had already spent 10 years in management positions, even in a business, out in the private sector. And I had learned an awful lot, and I'd been places in the world that others will never have a chance to see. I'd experienced things that other people had never had a chance to experience. But he was the one who put the little note in my box that said, "It's those hundreds of books in great literature that you read that are giving you wisdom. It's not the textbooks. It's not the relaying of knowledge, the rote memorization of facts. It's the fullness of all of those hundreds and thousands of lives that we are able to peer into momentarily, consider, and then compare and contrast with all the others that we've read." And I think a lot of my students, when they finish their years of what we might call formal learning, I call it school learning, and that's when they come to me and they go, "Whoa, now I'm kind of getting it. It's starting to come into a full vision for me. I'm starting to understand that there are natural ways of responding as a human that will then cause a natural reaction within a human's world. And that understanding is, and how to deal with that, is what we call wisdom."
Yeah, and I've noticed that I've come to most of my aha moments from reading fiction.
Absolutely.
I've never really
That's
come
what
to.
said, it's the novels.
Yeah, yep, the novels like The Alchemist, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've read that, but the Alchemist, The Stranger,
Mm-hmm.
and Siddhartha were probably the
Mm-hmm.
3 most influential books in my life.
Those are the 3 very good ones to have. As
Yes.
influence. That's the way I see it. And you're looking at fiction. Other books have been put in front of me as a teacher to consider, and I've read those books, and I've read them and layered them and understood them, and then I've gone ahead and rejected them as an option within a classroom environment. And I could go through a whole list of them, and many of them are more contemporary books. One of the reasons that I reject them, though, is because in the modern day, we attempt, and I've had this so many times, we attempt to manipulate and shape meaning to assuage our guilt.
Our guild?
Our guilt.
Guilt.
Our guilt. The way we feel guilty.
Okay.
And it makes me wonder sometimes if some people are fooling themselves into thinking that if they can make this world appear in this way with these types of results, that it will defy all natural consequences that come to man from having made those decisions.
That's not possible.
It's misconstrued, even prior to the act of even putting the notes on a page. You've misconstrued what it is to be human. And then when you see it play out in a story, or you read it in a book, someone who's an astute learner, astute reader, will sit it down and go, this just doesn't make, it's just nonsense.
Because they don't see it.
Well, because it's wrong. Because the natural way of consequence has manifested itself so many times in your life.
Okay.
The natural consequence that comes from these actions have manifested themselves in great literature that you've read over and over and over and over again. And the preponderance of that evidence just comes raining down upon your mind so quickly and with such force, you just put it down and go, wow, that's nonsense. And there have been many books that I've read 3-4 chapters in and went, wow, I hope this person finds what they're looking for, because it's not going to be found through the writing of this.
Yeah, I was reading, what's it called, Anti-Oedipus.
Oh yeah, I've heard through the grapevine. I haven't had a chance to read it. Tell me more.
It's well, it's written by a schizophrenic, and it is very difficult to understand. But essentially, you're familiar with Oedipus, right?
Oh
Like
yeah,
Freud.
Oh yeah. Well, Sophocles' play I've wanted to study, but yeah, it's a pretty hard one for us to grasp as humans. But yes, please. How does he characterize it? This
Well,
author?
I mean, essentially, there's dad, mom, son, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this 3-part thing is seen in so many things in our society, specifically the Bible with the Holy Trinity, where Jesus is
Absolutely.
the Son,
Mhm.
Dad is God, and Mom
Right.
is what's the
Conveyed through the Spirit. You're saying, is that what?
yeah, like the Holy
Holy Ghost.
Spirit,
Yeah.
the Holy Ghost. Yeah. There's those 3 things, and in Anti-Oedipus, he claims that it's a sort of a sequel to Nietzsche's Antichrist,
Okay.
in a sense that it's the breaking down of Oedipus. It's the breaking down of everything being caused by your parents in psychology, the breaking down of having these hierarchies in society, having like the daddy government or the mommy government or whatever, instead having this more like level playing field.
Okay.
It's an interesting read, difficult to understand. He has some good points that are somewhat comprehensible, but I would go ahead and read it yourself, because
Well,
I can't really explain it.
obviously, it's going to be quite a ride.
Yeah.
Um,
I didn't finish it. I got halfway
have
through.
you read Notes from the Underground? Dostoevsky?
I would love to.
Oh, sounds a little bit like the adventure reading Notes from the Underground. That is one of those, well, and then a lot of my favorite Russian authors will put you through that kind of a ride, a really rough ride. because these types of characters just have to absolutely know something, and absolute knowledge is just outside of our grasp. It's just always just right there, and we just can't fully grab it and grasp it for ourselves. And so that's another part of the grasping thing that is talked so much about. But also seeing what you consider mundane, everyday, and boring through the eyes of somebody who has that type of perspective so much different than yours is also kind of an adventure in a way.
It is.
And I think that's part of the adventure of learning too. I can't just find somebody who is a lot like me and have a meeting of the minds and really get through all the various elements of something and come to a fullness of understanding. I need somebody who's different. I need someone who has a little, maybe we may call it quirky way of interpreting some idea or concept. That's the fullness of knowledge. I like to hear those kinds of perspectives, and I like that type of learning because it takes something that we thought we knew and reimagines it in such a way that we start to question what we knew and gain more knowledge and understanding and wisdom through doing that.
Exactly.
Because if your knowledge gaining is for a purpose of expanding one's wisdom, knowledge then has a role in that pursuit. I just think now we really don't get the fullness of knowledge. We're getting, everything's abbreviated. I mean, we went from YouTube, average 15-minute videos?
Yeah.
But prior to that, we had 190-minute videos. Or we would do documentaries at 3 and 4 hours long. And now we're at TikTok, where, what is it, like 2 minutes you get or something?
I think it's like 10 seconds or something.
Oh, yeah.
It's like 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Okay, you get that much, and that's it. That's all you're going to get. And sure, you're getting a smattering of this and a smattering of that, and then you go, whoa, I make this great declaration that I have all this knowledge. No. And then once you have the knowledge, what are you doing with it? Are you working to fully understand something? I have to ask myself that too. Every time that I start to jump to conclusions. Wait. What haven't you looked at?
Yeah, and it's hard to stop yourself there. I've also noticed that when I'm in that grappling towards knowledge, grappling towards wisdom state, I get to this point where I have all these thoughts. I'm thinking, okay, I'm almost there. Like, I'm almost to the truth. I'm almost there, almost there. And then I get so close to it and then slips away.
Yep, slips away. Or even your state of consciousness then shifts and it's taken from you.
Yes, exactly. Because then you think, oh, wait, that's not exactly true. Then your thought evolves more, and then you get to another point that becomes destroyed. But that's also something, I know that you just read all of Nietzsche's works. And have you read Zarathustra yet?
That's where I am right now. That's where I've been working is with Zarathustra. But I haven't gotten as full into it as I wanted to. School started.
Yep.
Dang it.
The most important aphorism in there is about the camel, lion, and child. It's near the beginning, I believe.
I remember I went through them one after another. The lion and the child. Okay, go ahead.
It's about, essentially first we're a camel. We're a slave to society.
Mm-hmm.
We're, our backs are broken in, right? And then out of this slavery, we want to rebel, so we become the lion. And as the lion, we try to destroy this thing called the dragon. And the dragon is this fire-breathing thing that yells, "Thou shalt and thou shalt not," upon us, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we want to destroy this dragon. But then we become the child. And in becoming the child, we are free from the dragon, because as a child, we can see the whole world and we can see beyond the thou shalts. And instead, we say, I will do this, regardless of your thou shalts, right? You're not rebelling anymore at that point, because
No.
you're just being you.
Right.
And it's not a rebellion to be yourself.
It's will to action, we call it.
Yep.
Yeah.
And the thing about children is that they're intensely curious. And curiosity is how you gain knowledge. That's how you gain wisdom. So,
Continued curiosity is
Yes.
the one little caveat that I throw in when I'm talking with students. I always say, how many supposedly grown people do you know who gave up on it a long time ago and decided that pleasure could fill that hole?
yeah.
The temptation is always there too, as it becomes, as you'll notice this as you age, the temptation to say I'm old and I can't do, or I'm tired and I can't go anymore. You know, those kinds of things. I hear that and I think to myself, maybe I'm going to have to come to more of an understanding of that, but for right now, I'm still kind of defying it or trying.
Yes.
And if something takes 2 hours that used to take an hour and a half, so be it. But we can make all kinds of excuses for ourselves.
Yeah.
I think, I know that for me, one of the things that I do to try and bring clarity of thought and clarity of love as well is I have to deprive the body. And when you go through that process, you know, in the same way that the ascetics did, and you know, in large mass in Siddhartha, I don't know if you remember, depriving the body, it puts the mind and heart in the front, and it forces us to really consider every aspect of what's between the ears and what is in our intentions. And this summer I decided I would do a little bit of that more personal pursuit, and it illuminates so much.
Is that why you read Nietzsche?
Well, the reason I read Nietzsche, I've always read parts, and I was really blessed to have really good instruction classes, groups where we grappled with philosophical ideas throughout my education. And like I tell my students who want to have the best opportunity at learning and gain as much, go and sit next to the smartest people in the class. Go to the front and sit next to them and go and study with them and defer to them and ask and pose questions and have that meeting of the minds. Well, that kind of meeting of the minds in relation to certain philosophies, and Nietzsche is a part of it, had always left me with a wondering. So I took on a lot easier grapplings with philosophy through the years, and every time I would pick up Nietzsche and start reading, of course I'd be drowned in all of these accusations that they have in reference to him, because his sister was such a, how should we say it, soldier in the Nazi army. She was a soldier of ideas, and she was acquainted with Hitler, and it's one of the reasons why we have these kinds of connections that are often spoken of, and why Adolf Hitler would pull quotes from Nietzsche's work, and then it gets mischaracterized. So, well, and not just that. When you think about the pursuit of what the Nazis did and all that they used to justify their acts, you think to yourself, oh, wait, that must fall into, this must fall into that category. And I think that I maybe wasn't at the point where I could take it apart and really see. Areas where assertions are made under certain conditions whereby one could gain power and bias. You know, I was
Yes.
thinking if it was there. But that's one thing you don't see in his work. There's no attempt at gaining power through bias.
No, there isn't.
And I think that's what changed my mind. And so I went back and started the process over again with a renewed sense of, I'm not worried about undue influence. I've read so much now. That's silly to ever think of once you reach the age that I'm at.
It's pretty hard to be dogmatic once you've read Nietzsche. So
Exactly. I think we live in a dogmatic world.
Yep.
When I was 20 something, I can't remember, 25, 26, I read Dianetics. And I was a little bit fascinated with L. Ron Hubbard. And one of the reasons I was fascinated with him was not because of what comes out of Scientology. The reason I was fascinated with his work is because he asserts something that no one else has ever asserted and been successful in doing so. Now, I could argue that's not success, but I still can't deny that when a unique perspective is placed within a very familiar ground, it brings something more to the understanding of that concept, whether we embrace it or reject it, or whether we think it's truth, or whether we think it's simply folly. My wise maternal grandfather, my papa, he used to say, Royce, all the people who have control issues will attempt to engage you in folly, distract you with things that don't matter in order that they can gain control of the things that do. So if you feel like you're somehow being manipulated, look to the folly and see if that's the case. Is it foolishness that you're being asked to perform? Is it just foolishness that's being asked of you in terms of your contribution? Are you challenged? Do you ever question? And if you don't, you're being led down the merry path of folly. And that particular piece of wisdom, and the one about when I was a very, harried manager, I learned that you can't manage based on crisis. And that's another aspect of life that we tend to, mistake. And that is that you can. When the crisis comes up, I solve it, and then I'm moving forward and everything's great, right? No, what you do is you tend to just sit there and get caught in that mire of solving the problem after it's become too much, and only solving it by, like popping the bubble, by putting an end to it, or by changing it so much that it doesn't even resemble what it was before. And a lot of people do that with money. And that was one of the ways that I learned, you can't get yourself into debt with $60,000 worth of student loan debt and not have all the natural consequences that go along with it.
Exactly.
We lost one of our teachers last year, mid-year. And he had shared something with me that one night when we were just we were at a meeting, I think it was like a union meeting or something, we were just talking, he says, Royce, my wife and I, we went to sign our mortgage. We went to the meeting at the title office, and when they were looking at some things, they said, wow, you already have a mortgage. And he said, no, I don't have a mortgage. I just have $156,000 of student loan debt.
Wow.
And they were just looking at the number thinking, oh, well, he must own property. Now, fast forward 23 years. No, 19 years. Part of what broke him as a teacher was the fact that he's carrying this humongous load of debt.
And it just crippled him.
It made it's a natural consequence. It makes everything around him, or at least from my perspective, and this is the way I perceived it, a much more difficult task, a much more difficult condition. It tainted his pursuits. And that's what I mean. You can't just say, no, it's not going to happen, or you can't just fool yourself into thinking, well, I can deal with this, and then when it comes to a crisis later, I'll take care of it. Because it doesn't. And let's say we do forgive his loan. Let's say all of us are wanting to do a charitable act, and so we do that. Are we doing him a favor? Are we doing us a favor? That's what you have to start asking yourself. Am I attempting to defy natural consequences?
The thing is, you have to forgive yourself.
Yeah, and he's doing so much better now. Maybe getting out of education is what it took for him to feel that release of pressure. I'm not sure. He seems to be doing better now.
I think that's a good spot to end it.
Good. Sounds like a plan. All right. Well, we didn't get too much into 7, but we'll do that next time. Or something like it.
Sounds good.
All right.
Thanks, Mr. Johnson.
You're very welcome.